Welcome, everyone, to the Metrics International Forum. The forum is organized by the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford, or for short, Metrics. The center is directed by John Ioannidis and Steve Goodman, and we are a research group and fellowship program dedicated to finding ways to improve the validity and transparency of scientific research. I'm Lena Koppel. I'm a visiting postdoctoral scholar at Metrics, and I will be today's moderator. All of our forums are recorded and can be accessed on our website. Please mute yourself during the talk and keep your questions until the end, or write them in the chat. So our presenter today is Rachel Coulthard-Graf. Rachel is the Fellow Skills and Career Development Lead at EMBL, where she and her colleagues deliver resources and training via the Fellows Career Service and Complementary Skills Program. Rachel joined EMBL in 2016, following 6 years as Program Officer for EMBO Young Investigator Programme and a short role as Research Manager for Graduate Studies at Cancer Research UK's London Research Institute. She holds a PhD in Biochemistry and Molecular Biology from University College London and a master's in chemistry from University of Oxford. So if you're ready, we can start.
Great. Thank you, Lena. And yeah, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to talk about some work that we published last year that focuses on the PhD and postdoc training outcomes at EMBL. And I thought it probably makes sense to start by very briefly introducing what EMBL is and give you some context for the study. So EMBL is an intergovernmental laboratory for life science research. What that means is that we're a research institute that is not in a national system, but is actually funded by 29 member states. We were established 50 years ago and have now grown to become, over 2,000 people working on the 5 missions that you see here, including excellent research and scientific services, including experimental and data services. But the mission that I think is closest to my heart and most relevant for today is advancing training. So one of the core missions is to train the next generation of life scientists. And EMBL has actually one of the oldest structured PhD programs in Europe. We have right now around 260 PhD students who normally stay with EMBL for around 4 years, so slightly shorter than the US PhDs. And we also have some postdoc programs, and we have a similar number of postdocs at EMBL. What also makes us kind of unique is that we're not just one laboratory. We have 6 sites spread across Europe, and the 2,000 staff at those sites are also very international. We have, I think, 96 nationalities right now at sites in Spain, Italy, the UK, Germany, and France. So why were we interested then in doing some meta research and understanding our training outcomes? I hope it's probably not new to you that the number of PhDs has been increasing globally. But the data we have on the number of faculty positions suggests that that hasn't been growing at the same rate. And historically, becoming an academic faculty member, particularly an independent research group leader, was the most common, most preferred career option for PhD students. So even in 2019, there was a Nature survey where 56% of PhD students said that academia was their preferred long-term career path. But because the number of PhDs trained has increased faster than the number of faculty positions, we see that today actually a much lower proportion of of PhD students go into this career path. So you see data here from the National Science Foundation showing that the percentage of US life science doctorates entering tenure track positions has halved since 1997, and in 2015 was just 8% of former graduate students. Unfortunately, in Europe, we don't have such consistent data, also because the number of different academic systems across all the different countries in Europe. So that's why we were interested in doing this, and we had some very clear some clear questions that we wanted to answer. We wanted to know what career paths EMBL PhDs and postdocs go on to after EMBL. So what percentage is academic, but also what's the variety of other career paths? We also wanted to know, do we see something similar to what I just showed for the US data? Are fewer of our PhDs and postdocs going into academic careers than previously? And we were also intrigued to know, are there particular factors that are predictive into entry into these different career areas? So we collected data, and quite a lot of data. So first of all, we identified all the people who had graduated from our PhD program between 1997 and 2020. That was almost 1,000 people. And we also looked for people who'd spent at least 1 year as a postdoc at EMBL in the same time period and had left in that time period. We were quite lucky that we have a strong alumni relations program already at EMBL, so we knew actually where quite a lot of these people had gone to, and using online searches, myself and an intern in the team, Mauricio, spent a lot of time Googling to confirm not just the current role of these alumni, but also to identify every position that they'd held since they left EMBL. And that was over 5,000 positions that we could identify. In addition to some demographic data that we had on the alumni, we also collected publication data as one of the potential predictive factors. And we found 7,000 EMBL publications that had at least one of these 2,000 alumni on them, and was done at EMBL. Using that data, we could then analyze the career outcomes. To do that, of course, we needed to have to classify the roles, and we used actually a free level taxonomy that has been published by others previously, but also then grouped these different types of positions into 6 major categories. 3 of them within academic research, teaching and scientific services, primarily principal investigator, so someone leading an independent research group, postdocs, so people on a postdoc contract, and then unfortunately we had to group all the others because there's so many different types of academic research teaching positions, and it's particularly difficult to come up with a consistent classification system when you're looking at many different countries that have different academic systems. So we put everyone else in this one category. Outside academia, we looked at then, are they in a role that appears to be carrying out or overseeing research in industry? As EMBL is a life science institute, you can imagine most of these were doing drug discovery research in pharma or biotech, but we also have other types of research in here. And then for the other positions, we looked at whether or not this seemed to be science related. So there we included things like science policy, being a journal editor, patents, doing sales or marketing for a science product. And then not science related was anything outside the science sector, This would include, for example, someone who goes to Boston Consulting to do general business strategy consulting. So those were the classifications. What percentages do we see? So we looked at the current role when we collected the data in 2021. What we found was that, at a global level, most alumni actually stayed within Europe. So 82% were within EMBL's member states. I think around 11% went to the US. And in terms of these different classifications, more than 50% of alumni were working within academia, and half of those were in principal investigator roles, roughly, so 28% overall. Both industry research and science-related positions were fairly well represented, both with 15% of alumni. And actually very few were in non-research positions. One thing we would have really loved to have done with this data was also to look at whether or not people had successful careers. But unfortunately, this was a retrospective study, just looking at the career paths, not a survey. And I think it's really important that when we're talking about successful careers, we really measure that by, is this career meeting what the person in the career wanted from their career? So we can't look at success. But one thing we looked at as a heuristic for this was at least whether or not their employer seems to value their skills. To do that, we looked at the job titles and noted whether or not it contained an indicator of seniority. So words such as senior, manager, chief, principal. And actually we found that outside academia, 59% of our former PhDs and postdocs had a senior job title. So we think that people are entering good careers also outside academia. There were also a real variety of roles outside academia. So you can see here a further breakdown of those working in science-related roles, excluding industry research. Really everything from consulting to intellectual property and law, product support, science communication, real wide range of roles. So yeah, we see academia was a major career outcome, but that there's also a real wide plethora of different roles that people went into. One question I get a lot when I present this data is whether or not we see any differences according to the gender of the alumni, and probably doesn't surprise you to know that we did. So we found that male alumni were more often found in the principal investigator roles, whereas female alumni more often went into science-related roles. We didn't try to understand the reasons for this because I think there's many. But one thing I also want to note is when we survey our current PhDs and postdocs, actually, we also see a difference in the preferences for careers. I think that's probably one factor. And my personal feeling there is we should maybe be doing more to make sure that academia remains an attractive career for everyone, and in particular for underrepresented groups. Okay, so that was what we see if we look at the current roles. But actually one of the main drivers for doing the study was to understand the trends with time. And here I was really lucky that when I presented a pilot version of this study fairly early on in the project to EMBL's senior scientists, one of our senior scientists, Wolfgang Huber, whose group has a lot of statistical expertise, volunteered to help with the analysis, and Bernd, Johan, and Britta and his team helped to do some of the modeling that I'll show you later. But first, a basic level, to explain that when we looked at the trends with time, we did this by splitting our 2000 alumni into different cohorts. So we looked at 3 8-year cohorts that you can see here. And here you see the career outcomes for those different cohorts in 2021. And of course, here we see some clear differences, particularly in the percentage of principal investigator roles. But that doesn't really help us that much to understand what extent those changes reflect career stage or changing outcomes as the career landscape has changed over the last decades. There is where the data, really detailed time resolved data we had comes into play, because that enables us, for example, to say, okay, do we see differences at specific time points? So if we look for those that we had a complete career path for, do we see a difference at, for example, 5 years after EMBL? And you can see that here we clearly see a difference between the oldest cohort and the more recent cohorts. One difference we also saw here, however, was that there was also a difference in the career trajectory in terms of how long it took people to become a PI after getting their PhD. So between the oldest cohort and the middle cohort, the 2005 to 2012 cohort, we saw around a 1-year increase in the average length between those two time points. So to do a more detailed analysis of this, my collaborators then were able to build to fit the data to Cox proportional hazards models, which you might know are a statistical regression method that's often used for time to event distributions. I think most commonly you see it for example, for mortality data for clinical trials. But we used it to model entry into our different types of roles. And you see here resulting Kaplan-Meier plots that effectively plot entry into becoming a principal investigator by time after EMBL for our PhD alumni and our postdoc alumni. And here the difference is immediately clear. You see that there's a real difference between where the entry plateaus, and it's almost a 50% reduction. Nevertheless, the percentage of alumni from the 1997 to, the 2005 to 2012 cohort that became PIs was over 25%. And there was actually no statistically significant difference between the middle 2005 onwards and most recent 2013 onwards cohorts in terms of entry into these roles. So from this, we conclude there's definitely a difference in the career outcomes, but it seems to have stabilized. And yeah, there's still around 25% becoming principal investigators. Yeah. Here, I also want to mention that whilst no one's done quite such detailed time-resolved analysis, there are quite a lot of institutions, particularly in the US, who have released data on their PhD career outcomes, including Stanford. And we were able to then compare our data with the career outcomes they saw at particular time points. And from this, I mean, it's always a bit difficult to compare different institutions, but we didn't see any, but yeah, with those comparisons, we think that other institutions probably see something similar. There was no stark differences in the career outcomes for the more recent cohorts, for example. So most likely we think this is a global trend, also similar to the data I showed you from NSF before. So the global trend is that fewer people are becoming PIs. The next obvious question is, where are they then going for their careers? And here we actually saw increases in all three of the types of non-academic career that we looked at, so industry, science-related, and non-science related. Yeah. And on a positive note, what we also saw, we're interested to look at here is for the data I told you about previously on whether people had senior job titles, whether we also still see people going into senior roles. And even if we look at the most recent leavers from EMBL, so those who left up to 5 years before we did the data collection, 45% of those held senior positions, compared to 59% if we look at everyone, including those who left back to 1997. So we think that people are still entering or being promoted into good roles. Great. Okay, then I'll come to talk a little bit about the which factors were predictive for entry into different career outcomes. And here, publications was an obvious one. Others have previously shown that this correlates a lot with entry into academic careers. So I mentioned before, we collected over 7,000 EMBL publications with authors from the study. On average, each alumni had 4.5 publications, 1.6 of those as was as a first author on a research article. And again here, Wolfgang's group were really helpful at then looking about whether or not publications or what else was predictive. They generated multivariate Cox models and calculated something called the Harold-C index, which effectively measures the predictive power of the factors included in the model. The C index is on a scale up to 1. 1 would mean that the model would be able to predict for every pair of people in the study, so if you take 2 people randomly from the study, it could predict based on those factors which individual became a PI, in this case, first. And 50% is the baseline. That corresponds to random guessing. When we included all the data we collected in the study, which included the various demographic things, and both the number of publications as well as crude estimates of the reach of those papers, such as citations and the journal impact factor, our model was able to predict in 70% of the cases who became a PI first, which we think actually is not that bad, given we're not including in their motivation. So did they actually want to become a PI? We can't measure their skills. We can't measure their reference letters. All we have is their publications and some demographic information. And actually, taking the different groups of factors, publications alone was almost as predictive as the full model. In terms of predicting entry into other types of roles, actually for almost all the other types of role, the most predictive factors were the time and cohort. So what was the year they left EMBL and which of our cohorts did we put them in? And publications were less predictive. But I think it's actually the predictive power of the publications is actually most visible actually in this Kaplan-Meier plot, which shows the entry into PI roles stratified by the number of first author publications. And you can see that for entry into PI roles, for postdoc alumni with 2 or more publications, they were 6.6 times more likely to be found as a PI overall than those who had no publications. Whereas for entry into industry research, in contrast, where publications were not very predictive, there's only a slight difference in that people with no publications were more likely to go into industry. Yeah. Then I'll comment a little bit on the trends we see with time in publications. So what we were interested in this because we know that the number of authors on publications has been going up. There's also a really nice paper from Ron Vale a few years ago that also talks about the amount of data per paper, which has also been going up. So we were interested to see, do we see any trends in terms of the number of publications people have? What we saw was firstly that we also see more authors per paper, just on these 7,000 publications. It's quite a clear trend. And in terms of the average number of papers per individual, actually the total number of research articles, there was no statistical significant difference between the cohorts, but we saw fewer first author research articles per person. You can imagine if you have more authors per paper, fewer of them can become the first author. Yeah. So to conclude, I told you that, yeah, our data shows that EMBL alumni enter a diverse range of careers, that we've seen a reduction in the number of people following the classical academic path, from PhD, postdoc to PI, though this actually remains the most common of the career paths we looked at. Nevertheless, non-academic career paths have become more important. In terms of what correlates with career outcomes, we saw that there were other factors that correlate with this, including gender and publications. And in terms of publications, they've become more collaborative. And I think together what this shows is that it's important to provide career development support to early career researchers that reflects this diversified career landscape, and training also that that recognizes the challenges of collaborative projects. So there are also benefits here. One of the things we've heard a lot from industry, for example, is what they're really looking for from the scientists that they bring in as teamwork. And of course, these collaborative projects offer a great opportunity to build those skills, but it can also be challenging for someone who wants to stay in academia to build up an independent portfolio in more collaborative projects. Yeah. Then I'd like to end briefly by also mentioning about how we use that data, because we did the data with a purpose back in 2017 when we just started a pilot career service for PhDs and postdocs. And one of the aims was really to underpin what we do in that service with the data. So you see here, for example, a slide from the welcome event that I join, organized by our postdoc program. And you can see here already when they join EMBL, we show them the career outcomes of postdocs. And we also then support them in their career development. In 2019, we moved the career service from a pilot project that was working with just one of our postdoc programs to a service that supports all PhDs and postdocs at our 6 sites. And we also launched in the same year, 2019, a set of complementary skills courses that aim to help PhDs and postdocs develop well-rounded skill set. But in particular for the career service, where we have a variety of activities that support people finding out about their career options, making decisions on how to pursue what they want, and then applying for those. For these activities, the data really helps us promote discussion with the PhDs and postdocs around their career. We use it, for example, in our workshop on self-awareness and career exploration, where we talk about some of these different options. We've built up also a set of resources that explain what these different career options look like. But we also have discussions with them in other contexts. For example, this was a slide from a presentation at a PhD retreat where we also discuss that there's not a single career path, but that there is some, if limited, movement between these sectors. And we also use the data to discuss, along with data from others, what the realities of an academic career are. Yeah, and with that, I'd like to conclude with some acknowledgements. So firstly, to the people who were involved in the study or supported it, as well as to my colleagues who helped deliver the career service and complementary skills program. And I'm happy to discuss if there are questions.